of Applied Science in Gelsenkirchen, Germany. And additional to that, I am the chairman of the board of the TeleTrusT Association. At the university in Germany, our research focus are cyber early warning systems, cyber situation awareness, and internet key figure systems, and trustworthy IT systems. And additional, we do research in the field of botnet detection, mobile security, identity management, and security for smart car, smart grid, and smart traffic. So that's what I'm doing.
Thank you. It's good to be here again. I'll tell you what I did in the past, what I'm doing now. I was the cybersecurity advisor for both President Bush and President Obama, Chief Security Officer of Microsoft and eBay, a computer crime investigator as law enforcement for 20 some odd years. Currently, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, and I have a partnership, and I'm also executive director of a nonprofit called Safe Code. It's about how do we write more secure code to reduce vulnerabilities. Of course, Symantec is a member of it. Thank you.
I think I sort of over-introduced myself, but I'm Cheri McGuire. I'm the Vice President for Global Government Affairs and Cyber Policy here at Symantec. Basically, my group supports the overall business in what we call the 4 Ps, which are policy, politics, partnerships, and programs. And so those are the 4 areas that we are cross-functional across the entire company. Prior to coming to Symantec about 3.5 years ago, I was at Microsoft in their Trustworthy Computing Group doing critical infrastructure protection and cybersecurity policy. Prior to that, I was at the Department of Homeland Security. My last position there was as the director of the National Cybersecurity Division in the U.S. CERT. And then I spent another 12, 14 years before that doing both consulting work and as well as in other government positions.
Hello, my name is Joerg Borchert. I'm the Vice President for Chip Card and Security for Infineon Technologies in the Americas, and I'm in the semiconductor business for 20 years in different fields, wireless as well as security. And I'm also heading the Trusted Computing Group as President and Chairman, and we are pursuing international standards to protect systems from the PC side all the way to embedded systems.
Hi everyone, I'm Kurt Roemer, Chief Security Strategist with Citrix, also a member of our CTO office. I focus on ideation for security, compliance, and privacy, get very involved with a lot of industry groups, and recently extremely involved in telecommunications. So I was just named Rapporteur for the NFV, or Network Function Virtualization group within ETSI, for developing security and trust guidance for the next gen of telecommunications systems. So quite a bit of interest on that end, as well as it ties everything together.
Great, thank you, Kurt. The basic format for our session today is going to be about 60 minutes with the panelists discussing a variety of different topics that we have on the schedule today, which is, of course, global surveillance, cybercrime, and virtual espionage. In the final 30 minutes, we're going to encourage the audience to come forth with some questions of their own for the panel. And that's pretty much it for today. I think that it's going to be a great discussion. We have a fantastic panel lined up for everybody today, so let's just go ahead and dive right in, starting with a topic that Cheri briefly mentioned in her welcoming introduction, which is in the wake of the latest NSA leaks with Edward Snowden. There's been some interesting discussions around the need for trust in the IT security industry. So the question for the panel, and I think we'll start down on the tail end with Kurt, is how important is trust in the global IT security business?
Yeah, trust is absolutely essential, and it's really the next generation of how we can take a look at security. You know, security has historically been a lot of measures and practices that have been put in place to provide a baseline to cut down on fraud and theft and other bad things that are happening. But trust really defines a lot of the relationships that need to exist to be able to trust in a specific transaction or that something is valid. And it goes much further than security because it's very specific to purpose. You know, trust is something that you describe to fit a specific purpose, and it's only valid for that specific purpose. And in doing so, you know, trust becomes much, much more valuable. The real issue with this, though, is how do we describe trust in the systems, and how do we make sure that we have the right security measures so that we can describe trust both within an organization and between entities that you know, could be anywhere across the globe, and many of which are very transitory and only there for a very short time for the relationship. So we have to take a look at that from a financial perspective. We have to take a look at that from interchange and just in terms of sharing information between individuals and between organizations. You know, to me, trust is really the next frontier and what we need to be talking about.
Yeah, trust, and as I'm representing also the Trusted Computing Group, we got the questions, can you be trusted? What is trust? And with a membership of over 135 companies, which are basically representing large numbers of the IT industry, you can look at our website. We are basically covering networking as well as computing and embedded systems. So we asked ourselves, what represents trust? And there are three major elements to trust, according to, and you have to look a little bit there into social science actually. It's about openness, it's about transparency, and it's about diversity. And we have done that very particularly over the last, I would say, 4 years, with developing new standards, and we asked for international feedback from China, from Japan, from Russia, from India, and we have active participating members. And when you build these kind of system components, you basically have to put them into scrutiny. So we elaborated a lot of these term trust and how we can implement it so that our customers, basically who are applying this technology, can be sure that it is genuine.
Well, I don't think that I can say it strongly enough. Trust is the foundation of the business that we're in. As an IT company, as a security company, without trust from our customers, governments, and consumers, business, consumers, and governments, we don't have a business anymore. So for us, and that may be saying it very strongly, but I don't think I can say it strongly enough. If something shakes the foundation of the users of our products and services to the point that they no longer trust that we are handling their information or securing their systems in a way that is protecting their privacy, that is considering how data is shared, how it is used, I don't know how we can function in this environment. Now that being said, the Snowden revelations have brought a whole other layer of discussion that we as a company have, I think, worked very hard over the years to portray that we are a trustworthy entity. While we are not a company that has been named in that, we are swept in with all American companies. We all get painted with the same brush. And so it's creating a very difficult business environment. And I don't mean that just from an American company standpoint, but it is creating a difficult environment around the globe. And I think we'll talk probably more about that as the panel continues, but that difficult business environment doesn't just go to US companies. It actually makes it difficult for German companies, for other European companies, to sell and transfer their businesses around the world. So trust, foundational, fundamental to the work that we do. I'm sure that'll be a main topic of discussion.
Thank you, Cheri. From a historical perspective, when I started Trustworthy Computing at Microsoft, it wasn't based on what the government was looking to do. It was not looking what the pressure was. Matter of fact, some of the difficulties I had was a discussion that the customers are not asking for. They want usability, manageability, scalability, but there was nothing about trust or security. Part of our movement to start Trustworthy Computing, it was the fact in the United States in 1996 timeframe, the U.S. government created this thing called the Clipper chip. You were talking about on the ride down. And what it did, number one, to export encryption information outside the United States, it was a violation of the U.S. Munitions Act, same as it would be selling bombs or things in another country. The second thing, as we in industry were looking to be more secure using encryption, using S/MIME, using IPsec, all the technology we needed, the government prevented us from doing it outside the United States, which was stupid for multinational companies. So when we started Trustworthy Computing, it was beyond this and said, listen, not only do we need to make sure our customers trust us, but also we have to give them an IT platform that automatically gives them the ability to do that, to support their desires. The second thing, and I was just looking it up as Cheri was talking, I was not doing my email, I was checking it. In May of 2011, on behalf of the President, we released the International Strategy for Cyberspace. Not talking it's cybersecurity, but strictly cyberspace. The very things that Cheri had mentioned, and Norbert had mentioned, interoperability, trust in the businesses, the ability to coordinate internationally to make sure we do this. That was the core of the strategy we did. Unfortunately, we didn't coordinate with the intelligence agencies, so we didn't know this. And so that's one of the things when we look at the trust, not only do we have to do the trust, but in many cases we have to rebuild the trust. And in closing, I regret that it's not just the United States that in this boat. Because as these revelations have come forth, one of the things that we haven't seen, with the exception of probably 2 countries, we've not seen other national leaders sit up there, this is bad. The reason why is because everybody else is doing it. And that's the trust we have to build. We have to make a clear separation between the things that protect our citizens, which is what we expect the government to do, without violating our privacy, without creating an environment where we have to worry on a day-to-day basis, not only our personal information, but our business intellectual property, everything else, that's very much subject to what we've seen with the intelligence collection.
Now, let me bring in another aspect. If a company sells IT security, which is not secure, because the company has integrated a backdoor or a bad random generator, that is really a trust issue, and that's really a problem. And it's like a car without brakes. So well, you pay for IT security and get nothing. And the problem with IT is that the customer can't really test if the security is secure enough. So we need trust. That's the only thing we can build on. And at the moment we have a problem. And if I distrust a company, I go to another company which I trust more. So I believe that some US company have a problem and have to find out to re-establish trust. But at the end, trust is really important, and we have to find out how can we measure trust in the future.
Great, thank you. So let's delve into the issue a little bit. Let me see. Is this a little better for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's delve into the issue a little bit more about some of the differences between the Western Hemisphere and Europe and some other places around the world. I think that everybody on the panel today has some perspectives on this. We know that the protection of critical IT systems is of the utmost importance, particularly in developed economies where we're all trying to protect our intellectual property. I'd like to ask the panel, and maybe this time we can start with Norbert on this end, since the microphone's down there. What are your perspectives on the different approaches between what we see happening right now in Europe versus the United States in the protection of data?
Of data or critical infrastructure?
In the protection of critical IT infrastructure, yes.
Okay. I believe in general that the principle is the same. We would like to protect our critical infrastructure, and I can tell you something about what is happening in Germany at the moment. As you know, we made the decision to go from the nuclear power to the alternative energy supply, and that means that we build up intelligent smart grid, which also are connected to the internet, and that means that all the attacks we know from the internet also applies to our smart grids. And we also know from experience, if we have some problem with our power supply in Germany, then we have dead people. So this kind of infrastructure is really a cyber war issue. And so we need higher IT security solution to protect our modern infrastructure. And one idea, what we are doing at the moment in Germany, it's a so-called what is it? A gateway, a special gateway we try to establish, and it's the idea security gateway. And this gateway makes a connection between the smart home and the smart meter technology and the smart grid systems. And the idea is that this offer encryption, digital signature, very high level security model and separation technology, so that we have that we can protect us against this attack from the internet, but also ensure the privacy of the user. And the idea comes from the German Federal Office for Information Security, and I believe it's really high level, but if you see the potential of the cyber war, it's really necessary. So, and another point is in Germany we start to make much more research in the critical infrastructure. So I believe you can accept that from Germany we will provide really high level security for our modern critical infrastructure systems.
It's interesting when you talk about the critical infrastructure, not only from a privacy perspective, but also protection. The first thing is, and I'll use the U.S. lack of privacy laws versus the EU privacy law and the distinction. So instead of looking to adopt what the EU had put out, the United States spent a lot of time trying to get them to change what we were doing. And in the United States, I think many of you know that live here, you will trade your privacy for a free dozen eggs, which is a problem. The second thing is, particularly for multinational companies, how do you really build a business model that works? So as a citizen, my expectation when I'm in the United States to have some level of protection. When I go to Germany or Belgium or the UK, my expectation is different because the laws are different. And not only do you have the EU privacy policy, but even some of the member nations have different policies, and once again, multinational businesses, how do you build a model that works that way? The second thing, and it was interesting because just before I retired from the White House, the new Minister of Interior from Germany and the ambassador, we had a dinner at his house, and we were talking about critical infrastructure. And he asked a question that was a wonderful question. He said, how do you define critical infrastructure? And I'll give you two examples, both one in the US and one in Europe. So in Boeing Corporation in the US and EADS, they both build aircraft and different things for the military, for the government in both nations, of course, selling both ways. They sell commercial airplanes, the Boeing 777 and the Airbuses. They sell them to each other. We send them worldwide. They sell other things, satellite pieces, to various governments. So does that mean that they're all critical infrastructure? And for the most part, most of us that know this business say, no, not everything in the company is critical infrastructure. Which makes it more complicated is all those companies have child care centers, they have libraries, they have things that are benefits to the employees that get lumped in critical infrastructure. And we see this regularly. So is it a business unit within a particular business? Norbert talked about the power grid. Is every piece of a company's power generation critical infrastructure? Are there alternatives? And we collectively, across the world, we've not done a good job on defining what those are. After September 11th in the United States, we determined there were 17 critical infrastructure sectors. The food. So if you get your Kellogg's cornflakes not delivered in the morning, that's critical. I'm sorry, I'll eat some muesli instead of cornflakes. But that's the 17 sectors that we determined. But when it comes to IT security in companies, we're still not clear on what that is. And that's where we need to really work to understand what critical infrastructure is. Then we can prioritize what we need and we can actually solve some of the problems.
Howard, I think you did a great job of talking about the differences between the privacy laws and approaches between the U.S. and the EU. But I think when it comes to critical infrastructure protection and critical IT systems, we're actually more aligned. If we look at the approach that the EU has taken, there's some common things. One of those is we both, the U.S. and the EU, look at common best practices. We're both looking at collaborative approaches between industry and government. We're both looking at ways to utilize information sharing to protect those systems. And we're also all looking at ways to create incentives for adoption. I think the main difference that we see today is that the approach within the EU is one of regulatory with the data protection legislation. But also in the US, we tried that approach. It didn't get through Congress. And so the president issued in February of 2013 an executive order for a voluntary approach, which we just saw on February 12th released from the White House through the voluntary NIST cybersecurity framework. Now many people are calling the question, is that going to actually work? How are you going to get companies to adopt that and critical infrastructure providers? I think we have to take a little bit of a wait and see. This is a first step. But the White House has clearly designated that if adoption does not take place, that they will be looking to the regulatory agencies in the U.S. to put in place more required mandated measures across those regulated infrastructure sectors. So I think the approaches really are not that different. It's just maybe the way to get to the ends is slightly different. But overall, I think the approaches between the EU and US are quite similar.
I'd like to address a little bit the timeline. And Howard mentioned September 11th as a major turning point and what has been achieved so far. I would say both sides, US and the EU, have been relatively slow to solve the problem. The approach has been different from the perspective of the company I'm representing. There has been a top-down approach in the US and looking at the critical components first, especially concentrators and so on. Europe has looked at the endpoints, and so far when we look at the speed of deployment, it has been, from our perspective, relatively slow on both sides.
Okay, thanks. When we take a look at the issues right now between the U.S. and Germany, the relationship's really been called into question, right? From Snowden, many of the other things that have come out, it's caused both sides to really take a look at what is our relationship? How can we validate our relationship? Do we need to revisit this? It would be very similar to you having a friend that all of a sudden there's a critical event and now you just don't feel that you can trust them anymore to the same level that you could. What does that do to you? How do you feel about that? What does that make you actually do behaviorally? And that's what we're seeing here. You take things that you would have openly shared and now it's mine. You create this little wall around you and you create these enclaves if you have this happen with multiple people. And that's the concern right now with some of these revelations. You know, as Howard had said, you know, no surprise, there's many surveillance states that happen out there in the world for a lot of different good reasons to help protect the citizenship. You know, whether things have gone too far here or not, I'll leave it up to each individual to answer for themselves. I personally don't have all the data, that's for sure. But the relationship has been called into question. So one of the concerns here is to take a look at this from a political relationship as well as from an economic relationship. Say, how can we rebuild and how can we make sure that people aren't just saying, we're going to have our own enclaves. We're only going to do business with companies that are in this particular geography, or we're going to have our own clouds. We're not going to trust clouds in the US. We have to be very careful with those because when you take a look at some of the statistics, the IT Innovation Foundation just released a report that basically says between 10 and 20% of the business in cloud providers is going to be pulled back directly as a result of the Snowden revelations, and that people will not be dealing with US cloud providers because of that. The high end of that number has a $35 billion price tag associated with it. That's lost business for the US. Well, that's obviously gained business for a lot of other people as well and a lot of other potential geos. So I think one of the things we have to take a look at with this is just when you have an issue with any relationship, how do we define what's going on, what's important, help to get things back on a level playing field and have the transparency so that we know how we can trust each other moving forward, and that if there is a particular individual event that could cause a problem, that it's recognized and it's addressed immediately. If this doesn't get taken care of soon, we're going to have some real economic issues and some real political issues across the globe. And the U.S. and Germany, with the relationship that we've had and what we're doing together, can really help to rebuild and help redefine what trust means in this new mobile cloud economy.
So with that said, Kurt, there's I'm going to toss a related question to you, and something that both Cheri and Howard also touched upon, which is the issue of privacy. Privacy and security are deeply intertwined. I had a briefing just late last week in my office here in Silicon Valley with a European firm that is offering a certain type of technology to users around the world that basically gives us the ability to protect certain types of data, whether we're enterprise or consumer, but with European levels of privacy expectations and standards. So we know that there are differences between the United States and Europe, and yes, in the EU, you've got your EU directive, which is the baseline, and then each member state has to go and pass their own version of the EU directive, whatever it is that comes out, in this case, privacy, for instance. We know that countries like Germany will look at that EU directive and say, great, that's the baseline, and we have standards that are far up here, and we're going to exceed them. And then you have other nation states in the EU, such as Bulgaria and Romania, that say, we'll just let it go ahead and let that become our national law. In the United States, however, we've never really dealt with the privacy issue. There's a lot of discussion about it. We have different mishmash of state laws about, well, we have to advise people when there's been a data breach, but that varies by state. What's the way forward? What's the best way to look at the issue of data privacy, both on a personal and corporate level, when you're dealing with a global economy and global companies?
Wow, that's a great question. That's definitely a session in and of itself. I'll give some quick personal viewpoints on that, and definitely look forward to my esteemed panel members to fill in some of the gaps. One of the issues is we haven't done a really great job of describing privacy that reaches down to the individual. We do have EU privacy laws, which are phenomenal. Hopefully everybody's read all of this, but how do you actually use that yourself individually? And within the US, privacy is very difficult because you do give it away every time you go and use a loyalty card at a grocery store, or every time you go to use healthcare here, you sign the HIPAA form that says, hey, if you want your insurance to pay for anything, everything's shared, right? So that makes it a little difficult. And with so much of our lives being online and digital these days, we need a way to describe privacy so that people can do this in real form, so that you know, here's the information that I will share with my personal contacts, here's the information I will share with my employer, with my customers, with my business partners, with my healthcare providers. And you have that level of information defined and basically have a privacy firewall as part of your digital life that helps you understand what you're going to share with different people. Now, the reality is it doesn't work that way today, does it? Every time you download an application for your new iDevice or Android, you go through and you basically accept all these permissions. And every single iteration of those applications is even more permissive in terms of what it gets access to on your device. Pretty soon, everything's wide open. What we have to do as consumers is step back and say, wait a second, we need granularity. We need the ability to say, here's what's important to me, here's what I don't want to be sharing with other people, and here's how I can know that it is not being shared, and that I do have that level of protection. We need that in our technology. We also need a really easy way to describe that so that every individual can make their own decision. Much of it is generational. I personally do not share a lot of information. I look at some of the younger generation, and there's an incredible amount of info that they will share without even thinking. Maybe as they get older, they'll wise up, but we'll see.
Yeah, I would say there's a fundamental different privacy angle from the US and from Germany. And as we are an international company, a little example, I mean, I had last week a workshop and a German fellow spoke up and said, I'm so and so old. Age is a major privacy issue in the US, especially when it comes to HR. So you see that there are different angles to the same topic, which is called privacy. For a global company, we have to somehow live up to, and this was a question, how do you protect data on a global basis? On one hand, there is compliance with the laws in the different countries, but as a German-based company, we mainly apply very strict privacy laws and data protection into our systems. And this has, on one hand, the privacy aspect, but on the other aspect, it has a clearly economical aspect. How do you protect your IP? Because in today's world, it's not about factories, it's what the people have in their mind and what they generate and the patents, and this drives basically the value of a company. And I think this is also valid absolutely for US companies. Here we are on the same page.
I'd like to give it to you.
Well, obviously privacy is a very complex topic, and we probably could have, and there are conferences all around just IT privacy and online privacy. I think that there's a couple of things that I'll mention. One is today most U.S. companies ascribe to the safe harbor provisions, and that is our way of addressing the EU requirements for privacy. Now, that doesn't address sort of in the U.S., because Jarad, as you mentioned, we don't have really strong privacy laws here in the U.S. other than data breach laws. Right now, I think the estimate is 47 or 48 states have different data breach laws, and those are notification requirements should information be leaked or accessed by unauthorized entities. But those are a mishmash of policies and requirements. There have been calls for a national data breach law, but I don't think that gets fundamentally to the issue of privacy and privacy protection. And there are two aspects that I'll focus on. One is the ethical component of privacy and privacy protection. In fact, I just saw a piece last week where a big conversation that is beginning to happen within corporations is, should we have privacy as part of our ethics and compliance components within our companies, as opposed to just something that we have to meet, which is a check the box sort of, we have to meet all these provisions of safe harbor or other local laws in various regions. And ultimately privacy, and I heard this and I've used it a couple of times at a small discussion that I was at between the EU and US last fall. Privacy is primordial. You know it, you feel it as an individual, but you don't know always what it looks like. So when I get 19 pages of a EULA that I'm supposed to just click a box that says, yes, I accept it in order to download an app, how many of you read it? Okay. So I really don't necessarily want to go through all that trouble to protect my information and privacy.
But that's also one-sided.
It is. It's very one-sided. But that gets me to my second point, which is about privacy by design. And that is something that we as technology companies and technology providers frankly have to do a better job of. We have to make it easier for our customers, for consumers and businesses to understand how their information is being used, how they can easily opt in or opt out of programs that might use their data in certain ways. And I don't think that today that we have sort of the groundswell, we do in certain regions, but certainly not here in the US, a groundswell of how are we going to make it easier for the users of our products, the users of our information, to actually know that their privacy is being protected. Because we all know once your privacy has somehow been exploited, you can't take it back.
Thank you, Cheri. Jarad had mentioned how this is intertwined. The term that I've been using for years is security and privacy are the two sides of the same coin. On the privacy, because you don't have privacy without security. If you're not protecting your data with using good security, then the privacy is gone. The second part is when it controls. So I'll give an example. Cheri had mentioned the 47 states that all have different data breach notifications. When I looked at them, one says if the data is encrypted, you don't have to report. Other one says that if you even think that it may be gone, you have to report. Some say 14 days, others say 7 days. It goes back to my earlier comment. As a citizen, I have no idea what my rights are when it comes to this, but just the bigger the problem is, how do you develop a business model that has all these different requirements? So that's sort of one piece of it. The other piece of it, when you look at privacy from the big perspective and having it built in, it's just like everything else. There is different levels of privacy that we deal with. Once again, for an example, if I want to buy a new mobile, and this will probably, I think this is the 6th generation of mobile that I've got. Yet when I go into the shop, I have to give my social security number, my credit card number, my name, my date of birth, and everything, so they can prove by their standards that I'm going to pay my bills. I've been paying my bills nonstop for almost 20 years to that same phone company. So what we look at from a privacy perspective is, why not have effectively a self-destruct on your data? That you give it up, they validate what they need to validate, and it goes away. The other piece is how you control this. If I want to, which I do regularly, if I want to buy some parts for my Harley Davidson, all I want them to have is my email, my mailing address, and that's all I need. But for the government, for tax, they need a lot more. So if we have a policy from the government that says if you interact with us, it must be encrypted, there's no technical enforcement of that. Just like there's no enforcement of online transactions. We've seen the retailers recently. So we really have to develop a system where we own the data, that we control the data, we allow the companies have only what we want them to have, and when we're done doing business with them, they have to destroy it. That's a system that none of us are ready for. But that's the system, and maybe some of us in this room can say, this is the way to move forward with it. Because if not, what we can be accused of is nothing more than admiring the problem. And that's what we've done for all these years. We admire the problem. We say we're going to create a framework, or we're going to do some public partnerships. When I was home the other day, my wife made me clean up. And I found reports from 1997 on cybersecurity and privacy done by RAND Corporation, MITRE Corporation. From 1997 to the year 2000, we started creating these information sharing analysis centers, report after report after report. I read through them. They are saying the same thing that we're saying in the President's executive order, the same thing all of us are saying around the world, the exact same thing. Almost 20 years later, we've been admiring the problem.
Yeah, I think the question was, why we have so high requirements in Germany or in Europe. I think it's important for us to understand that a society which wants their citizens to be political or economically personally responsible has to protect the values and the integrity, the personal integrity of the citizen on the other side. And protect the value is an issue of IT security, and to ensure the personal integrity is privacy. And maybe we in Germany we have another culture background, and we like more security and we like more privacy. And this is one issue, and we have to find out how can we come to a common culture. So we have a global, international internet, and there is not really a border at the moment. I hope it will stay without a border. And we have to come to a common culture. So that's one point. And another point is that I believe a great portion of the problem with privacy, it's a business model paying with personal information. That means we use a lot of services and we not pay with money, we paying with our personal information so that the company can make money with online advertisement. And that was fine for Google and for Facebook at the first time, and they grow very fast, but now we have to start to discuss, can we find new business models so that we say, okay, an easy idea is we would pay for the search machine, for maps, or for web emails, and that's not a big deal. It's not so much money if you count what Google make on the turnover. If every citizen or every user would pay 10 euros a year, that would be enough to come to the same number. So what we need, it's new business models which protect our privacy. And I think privacy is really important, and I'm proud that the European and the German government take responsibility to protect our privacy, because it's really necessary for our future so that we can be personally responsible. So it's really needed quality for the citizens in the internet, in the world.
I think that's a really good point. I find myself increasingly asking myself, what services am I willing to pay for? But a lot of the times the issue here in the United States is, okay, so I pay for these services. Are they still doing things on the back end, selling my data? I would willingly pay in certain instances. Email, calendaring, address books, these kinds of things. I pay a Silicon Valley company for these things, actually. But I'm not convinced that they're not mining my data. And I think that should be part of the exchange. On a more funny, interesting topic, since Howard brought it up, and paying for Harley-Davidson parts, if anybody after the session wants to see some great photos of him, take a look at his Twitter account. So one of the key things that we haven't touched upon today that is really critical. A couple of years ago, before RSA, I published for Frost & Sullivan a really large market insight called Cybersecurity, a Global Economic Security Crisis. And when I was speaking with different CISOs, both in the defense sector as well as in the private sector, well, I guess they're both in the private sector, but you know, not ones that feed into defense quite as much. A lot of them were saying that right now, and this was a couple of years ago, mind you, that we are seeing the largest transfer of intellectual property ever in the history of the world. With that said, I know of a publicly traded company here in Silicon Valley that offers its executives full disk encryption for all of their laptops. And I have good sources in their IT department that says that people all the way up to the vice president level think that it's inconvenient and they won't use it, and then they'll take those laptops to China. So the question that I'd like to pose to the panel before we open up for questions with the audience is kind of a related two-parter. What types of IT solutions in general, without going after brands or particular products, should enterprises be using to protect their intellectual property? Because as we all discussed, in the developed world, IP is what our economies run on. And the second part is, what can we globally do to have governments work more closely together to combat things like industrial espionage and cybercrime? Because we see that there is cooperation, but it's kind of in fits and starts when it's convenient politically. So why don't we go ahead and start where the microphone is.
Yeah, I think most important for us is to understand that our IT and IT security technology we use at the moment can't stop the attacker. So if the attacker have enough money and the right skills, they will be go into every system successfully. So it's that means the technology we use have approaches which can't handle the challenge we have at the moment, and I really believe that we need some paradigm shift to cover these problems.
And this is where international cooperation should come into play a little more frequently, no?
Yeah, and if you see what are the problems is too many vulnerabilities in our software, insufficient anti-malware products, insecure website in the field, we're still using password for authentication in the internet and all these stupid things. I believe first important is that we have to encrypt significantly more our data during the communication with SSL, IPsec as well, S-MIME or PGP, and also for the stored information. And we measure it in Germany, and we see that at the moment every 125th IP packet is encrypted with IPsec. For IPsec it's normally used for business communication, it's 0.8%, it's not so much, but we see that every 7th IP packet is encrypted with SSL. That's nearly 40%, that's quite nice. But we have to push this, and we have to come to much more encrypted IP package, and then, of course, with the right secure and trustworthy technology. And the second important point is that we need more proactive IT security. And the idea of proactive IT security is that we work with security kernel, and then we have visualization, virtualization technology, separation, isolation, and with intelligent cryptography. And this produce much more robust and secure systems, and the systems will cost a little bit more money, but I think it's time to introduce this new technology so that we can better store our most important information. And we know that normally only 5% of the information of the enterprise is really necessary to secure it in the right way. And the third, maybe more longer term, it's that I believe we need much more object security. That means we have to protect the object with the idea of the life cycle protection and with distributed enforcement systems, so that the object can be securely transferred with every trusted systems in the world, and the object have rights which describe who can use it, which action you can use, copy it or look into it or change it or whatever, and in which environment you can use this action. That are really future-oriented new ideas, and we have to bring it into the field so that we are much more protected if you compare it with today.
Howard, since you were in the White House, maybe you have a unique perspective on this issue of on and off again international cooperation with cybercrime.
Yeah, before I do, Jarad, you had mentioned my Harley Davidson. I just want to be clear. I've had BMWs for a number of years. They're too high for small people like me. So I do have the BMW car. And it's interesting, when you start looking, here's where the geek in me comes out. When IPv6 became widespread, which it is, and we had a policy at the White House, all government agencies should move to IPv6. And you look at all the capabilities, they're free with IPv6. DNSSEC, BGPSEC, or Security BGP, IPsec, all these other security components built in to IPv6. And they're free. But look around how many people actually deploy them. We've talked recently about data being routed through China. I think the last one was through Norway. Because of BGP routing. Had we been using secure BGP, once again, which is free, that wouldn't have happened. But those are some technical things we do at. But Jarad, to your report about the policy side, even our friends we see as competitors. And I say this because in 3 countries, one that's somewhat controversial, but one friend in the United States. So there was one of the Nordic countries that their national strategy, which we all put out from time to time, they said they wanted to be the center of the world for IT services, which was very ambitious of them. They wanted to be the center of the world. Their IT services were going to be better than anyone else, including their security. The Chinese did a very similar thing that says they want to be the center of the world for IT services, IT security. That was their national strategy. We did in the United States. And every one of those countries, when I visit them, they look at the other one as being competitors. So when you start looking at and looking as how do you reconcile private-public partnerships where some of the government people see it as a competitive thing and don't really support it as we like. The second thing, and Cheri had been deeply involved in this from her work at DHS and now Symantec, when you start looking at what are the impediments to do some of these things, there's the company saying the cost involved. And one company I was involved with, they did a study how they could, and the idea was when somebody establishes an account, they would have to go through a 3-minute, only 3 minutes, tutorial on how to make themselves safer online, which makes the company better. They did a study and says if they require someone to do 2 more mouse clicks than a competitor, they go someplace else. 2 mouse clicks. And so that was their reason for not doing basic security information training. As we start viewing that, as Jarad's comment was, the largest transfer of intellectual property. Many of the high-tech companies in the United States say, yeah, they've stolen a lot of it, but by the time they use it, we're going to be in the next generation and the next generation. People have used $1 trillion number on this. We haven't seen it. So when you hear things like that, in reality it's something else that sort of does not give the companies the incentive to work towards it. And so that's the sort of thing we need to turn around when it comes to international cooperation. My last quick comment on this, probably 8-9 years ago, I was in Berlin and we were talking, I think it was BSI and myself, a couple other people, to take the health card in Germany and use that so you can buy something online and use it for different categories, because why should you have a authentication mechanism for multiple things. It never got done. And when I was over there recently and said, why didn't you get it done? Well, number one, the person who was driving it moved on to another position. And that oftentimes they're driven by a single individual that feels very strong about it. And the second thing is they couldn't find a way to federate it to where they may work in Germany, but what about Switzerland? What about Belgium? Because that was the ultimate goal. 10 years ago, we're still not there. So we do need the people, the business owners, the citizens to say, this is what we want, go build it. And where are we now? Somebody builds it and we use it.
So I'll go to the first question, which was on protecting intellectual property. And I think obviously encryption is an important part of that. We sell encryption as a company. But it's not the only answer. So as we all know, layered defense is the best approach. I want to comment though, Jarad, on your item around holistic encryption, because I have an interesting story. So for those who don't know, we're the PGP company at Symantec, and we're also a major provider of SSL technology. About a year ago, though, we looked across the enterprise and said, we've only got certain components that we consider critical using the holistic encryption on our laptops and so forth. We didn't have it deployed across the entire company, frankly, because we were only doing it for those systems and computers that we thought really needed to have it. And we went to deploy it about a year ago across the entire enterprise, and in fact ran into exactly what you commented on, which is resistance. It takes a lot of time to download. It's complicated for those users who are not technologists, but we did it anyways. And I think that goes to the point that sometimes, even though it might create a little bit of pain for your enterprise, you still have to do it. On the second point around what can nations do to work more closely together on countering intellectual property thefts, I think there's a couple of areas, and obviously the U.S. and Germany and the U.S. and the EU have worked closely on a lot of this over the last several years, particularly when it comes to the China question. And we obviously, in the aftermath of Snowden, there's a repairing of the relationship now. But I think we can't lose sight that we are like-minded nations who do not believe that theft of intellectual property should be used for economic advantage. And the collaboration can take place in a number of ways. Obviously through capacity building measures, whether it's law enforcement training or government-to-government exchanges. It can also happen through mutual assistance agreements, through law enforcement, as well as information sharing. And then of course common rules like the Cybercrime Convention and various agreements and treaties help as well. And then last, cooperation with industry. As global entities, industry I think brings a perspective to government that sometimes when it comes to new technology that's coming down the road, sometimes maybe is not always there. And so we need to make sure that industry is part of that dialogue as well.
I wanted to add on to Cheri's comment regarding the international aspect. I think standards are another cornerstone to build on. And it's sometimes a difficult task. China was mentioned, and China had in the past its own view how to implement also security in regards to cyberspace. It needs international outreach, and as a trusted computing group, we hope that we can create, especially when it comes to Trusted Network Connect, which is above IETF, to improve the security of the internet, to get China on board. It's something which is still not done, but the international cooperation is really something which we need and where there is a buy-in. On the other hand, there is competition, especially between companies, and therefore the second aspect, the protection of IP, are already pointed out earlier. You have to eat the cake you bake, right? This is sometimes not the case, or unfortunately, because of the usability. We have in our company a very centralistic approach. There is one major host definition and endpoint definition, so that IT can manage relatively smoothly these kind of updates, and the ultimate ratio is disconnect from the internet. And that is especially the case for the development sites and for the development networks. They are not connected to the internet.
Thanks. Jarad had asked us to comment on our favorite technologies that really apply to protecting information out there today. And I think all of us could pick a number of favorite technologies that we think we should be doing more of that would solve all the current problems, right? But that is the problem. We're thinking about current problems. What we really need to do is step back and say, there are some great technologies. However, what are the use cases here? What are we really trying to do? When you take a look at protecting the information really only has value in two states, right? When it's being used or being shared. All the rest of that really doesn't matter. What we're concentrating on, though, is protecting that information through a whole bunch of other areas that has absolutely nothing to do with those two states. And so we need to look at some of the technologies, we need to take a look at some of the policies, procedures, practices that help us protect information that is being shared, that is being used. We should be able to pick up an arbitrary computer that's completely untrusted and be able to know what level we can trust it to and what purpose, and have the data really be self-describing and self-securing, so that we're not relying on a trusted system to always do the right thing for us. We're relying on trusted usage, and we're really getting down to that basic concept of trust, knowing whether we can commit to a transaction for a specific purpose or not. And so, yeah, well, there's some great technologies out there. Let's take a look at how we're using those to really get things done, as opposed to just applying more technology because that's what we've always done in the past when things got bad. We know that's not working well, so let's innovate and do this better. Let's do it differently. Let's make it real this time.
Fantastic. Let's move on to the I would anticipate the more interesting part of the discussion today, which is the audience coming forward with some questions. Does anybody? Yeah.
Hello, I'm Doug Otis. I've had a background working with Fairchild doing security for nuclear power plants and that kind of stuff, and then I worked for Infineon Siemens doing disk drive design work and trying to figure out how to make those things secure. And now I'm in another company trying to do computer security. And quite frankly, when you get down to trusting anything, I don't think you can. And you look at the trusted platform modules, those things all are easily hacked within a few weeks using E-beam probes. The signatures pop out. They're just being protected with an 8052. Come on, they're simple. And so the bad guys hack those things within seconds, or not seconds, weeks. But once they're hacked, we're not agile enough to replace them. And so, I'm looking at how do I identify that the BIOS and the motherboard has been modified, because we're using chips now that have 8 megabytes of BIOS that update at a 4K byte sector, and you can easily change those BIOSes to do whatever you want to do. And you're going to say, BIOS, are you okay? Well, are you trusting the BIOS to say okay? And then the other thing, the disk drives. The disk drives, there's 2.1 disk drive companies in the world, and they're all being hacked. And how do you know that the drive is hacked? And they're designed to change sectors on a moment's basis. So when do you know to trust the computer that you say, I can trust? You can't. So what we can do, though, if you look at the systems we're depending on, like our e-commerce and whatnot, I was looking at a BIOS, I was looking at a compromised botnet that was occurring. and I saw that it was affecting the Social Security Administration in a big way, some large banks in a big way. I'm contacting them and saying, hey, you're owned. Your data is leaking out like a sieve. You need to take corrective action right away. The first I'm talking to dozens and dozens of their security technologists, and the first question they ask me, is this going to be made public? And I go, well, do you want me to help you figure out which systems are owned? I can give you signatures that will let you decide if this is a system involved in the compromise. They weren't interested. They wanted to know, is this going to be made public? And because, I'm under pressure from my company, we can't make it public, all interest faded. We don't care. And then I contacted the Social Security Administration. I said, look, I'm part of this. Your data has been compromised. I'm part of that. How can I protect my data? What happens if I decide that my data has been compromised? What do you do for me? Well, if I have a credit card, it's a 15-digit number. And at the moment, notice, I can say, hey, this data is compromised. They'll assign me a new number. The Social Security Administration, no, you have to prove 3 times that this has been used to screw you up. And then maybe they'll do it. And I said, what is your policy on that? They said, well, we can't tell you. I go, it used to be public. No, we don't tell you now. So they don't even allow you to know what the policy is for what happens to you when you find out you're screwed. Now, if we allow those numbers to be changed, then the bad guys would be caught in a second, because we know right away this number has been compromised. Does the Social Security Administration flag which numbers have been compromised? Hell no. Go contact a third party that's not responsible for anything and share all your information with them and hope that they'll protect you. What kind of system is that? It's crazy.
So this is a great story, but
well, how do we get to that point where we can trust? We can't even trust our own government. How do we get to a point where we can start trusting? And I don't see how
does anybody want to take up that question? How do we get to a point where we can trust?
You have to have a foundation. You mentioned some of the technical pieces. How can you use TPM to make sure the BIOS doesn't change? How do you do the actual due diligence on supply chain so you don't have something in the boot sector that, as we've seen, I think the one most noticeable was getting game credentials to, Afterlife or one of those other things. But the question is not how we can get there. The question is when are we going to start? And you look at the technical stuff, the business process that we've discussed during the panel and everything, we once again don't have a starting point that we unilaterally decide this is where we're going to start working it. That's the problem, and after that is when you actually start getting the trust built. You're the moderator, so you get to do the mic.
Anybody else?
Make a quick comment on that. Trust is something that we do need to be thinking about more and describing, and it's something that we need to push vendor communities, standards groups, others to make sure that we have a common definition of trust. We know how to build the trust chain, including things like attribution, including things like local and remote attestation. There are many different ways that we can infer whether we can trust something by taking a look at timings in NTP and DNSSEC and certificate services and others. We have many roots of trust out there that go beyond just the specific platform sitting in front of you. As Howard said, we need to use them. We need to be able to describe them, understand what elements need to be put together to be able to have low, medium, and high assurance of trust, and really be able to use this consistently.
Security and implemented security is at the end of the day a business case. And I wanted to point this out. And you can have implemented security, which is low level or it's high level. At the end of the day, it's an insurance case. Nothing more and nothing less. And how is the risk? And interesting enough, you can buy today cybersecurity insurance policies where you can insure your company against attacks instead of implementing software, hardware, and so on. Your risk factor is different. So take that into consideration.
there's one person right here, and then you over there.
Thank you. I'm Chris Jacoby, but let me first try a smart mouth remark here. Howard, you started 20 years ago, I heard you say. Now, what I'm doing with my company is I'm trying to make software trustworthy when it runs on an untrustworthy host. I would like to come back to the trust issue which we mentioned right away in the beginning. I heard you say 3 different definitions of trust in some sense. I heard first that trust is a very technical issue inside a program where it is very specific. And a few minutes later I heard trust is some global thing. You either trust the company or you doesn't. And if you don't mind, I'm separating this. You might not trust the company because they're making mistakes, or you might not trust the government because you just don't trust governments. So I would like to challenge you to define really what trust is. And trust stands as an example of almost everything in cybersecurity. There aren't people using the same definition.
Wow, as a market researcher, we have to struggle with definitions all the time. So which one of the panelists would like to take a shot at this one? I've been doing it for 14 years, so.
What's your answer?
The consultant answer is it depends.
We'll find out.
Yeah. Does anybody want to take a crack at this one? What is trust? I think that trust probably depends on which nation state you're in and which enterprise you're in, whether you're a private citizen or operating as an enterprise. It's pretty complex. I don't know, Cheri, you deal with this stuff all the time.
I think you just said everything that I was going to say, which is it does depend. It's incredibly complex, and I think that's a conversation maybe for an all-day workshop of trying to define what trust actually is. I think, we could each talk about it from a technology, an operational, a policy, a personal standpoint of what trust means to each one of us individually. I think getting to a common definition is really hard. You just raised it. You heard different definitions from us here on the panel. So that's not an answer. That's just, I agree with you. It's really, really hard to define.
One other real quick thing with that. When you're thinking about trust, think about why you need trust or why you don't need trust, and very specifically describe that use case. It's not, do I trust this other organization? Do I trust this government? Think about a specific purpose, describe the use case, then we can talk about it in some detail.
So to your point, trust, and I'll give you the definition because I looked that up. Firm belief in the reliability, truth, ability, and strength of someone or something. Very simply stated. And that's the way we look at it. You have confidence and trust in what you're doing, how you're doing it, what it's supposed to be doing, and the fact that it should not be doing something else. And in our world of IT security, or information security, cybersecurity, whatever we call it, that's the key that you build up on. Now, how you get to the end would be different, whether it's products, whether it be policies, whether it's government regulations, but the bottom line, this is how we define it, and this is we have to use as a baseline for our cybersecurity work.
My name is Clemens Feusler. I'm the founder and CEO of a security consultancy who is focusing on code security. You mentioned safe code before. I mean, code is the basis, the fundamentals of our of all our existence, all our economy, of all the countries you see outside. My question for the software vendors, especially for Symantec, is trust is a two-way thing. Yes, it's not a one-way thing. How much do you involve European experts in designing secure products? or do you only work with American knowledge or know-how?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking it, actually, because I think the story, at least from our standpoint, is a good, we truly are a global company. We don't just consult with U.S. entities. We work with the BSI and others in Germany as well as other countries, UK. I could probably go on and on about different nations that we work with on security of our products, whether it's both industry organizations or specifically governments themselves. So hopefully that answers your question.
And a couple of people back here.
Yeah, I have a question regarding a more concrete case of trust and surveillance. So my feeling is, if we look at the governmental role of trust and cybersecurity, we have two parts. So one part is the more legal interception part, which is related to homeland security and things like that. And then we have the part where the government takes responsibility for the security of the citizens and the economy and things like that. And so my feeling is that we need, at least if you look at the US, to have a more clear differentiations between the two tasks. So for us it is getting more and more difficult to convince people to use good things which come from the NSA, like SA Linux, because everybody's asking, okay, who pushed forward this and what are the reasons for pushing things like that. So the question to Howard probably would be, is this something which needs to be reorganized at the US side? We look, for example, at the German example, where we have a clear separation between the intelligence part and the part who's supporting security and IT security.
Thank you, and it's a wonderful question. So my first reaction is we have seen intelligence collection run amok. I remember, even before September 11th, I mentioned the encryption key that they were looking to have. And every time we move technology, intelligence agencies are saying, we need to move with it. We need to do this. So what happens is, what's very, very precise and very, very clear for them became growing bigger and bigger and bigger. We've seen what been released. So what we need to do is the transparency. There was, as a matter of fact, we were talking on the way down, there was the perspective that the reports that have come out, then terrorists know that we're monitoring phones, that we're monitoring their email, we're monitoring their satellite devices. There was a movie back in 1986 that showed that. So there should be no surprise. It's not as if terrorists don't know what's going on. But there has to be a lot of focus. There has to be international cooperation, particularly with our nations that are very close, like Germany, the UK, to some level France, to be able to say, here's the way we're going to do this. So our citizens have a higher level of confidence. You're really going to catch the bad guys, but you're not going to put me ordering my pizza in the middle of it.